Who is the so-called transcendental subject in Husserl's phenomenology? Last week, I met with a group in San Francisco to discuss the Cartesian meditations. And I think the transcendental subject is one of the most unfamiliar of Husserl's ideas. So this is just the first part of a multiple series of episodes. Now, the word subjectivity in transcendental subject refers, first of all, to what it's like to be a subject. In other words, what's it like to be a conscious being who experiences the world from a particular perspective? Subjective doesn't necessarily mean unreliable or biased, though it's often used that way in everyday English. Instead, subjective refers to the perspective from which a being, a subject, perceives the world around them and perceives themselves. Okay, but who and where is this transcendental subject? This is a term I imagine sounds otherworldly, obscure, even arcane, even for a student of philosophy who's not a specialist in Husserl. Likewise, even if you're studying phenomenological psychology, my field, you're unlikely to hear much about the transcendental subject, even from phenomenological psychologists, because it's outside of their normal focus for reasons that I'll get to. There's one very important exception to this that I'll get to in a future episode, and that's Larry Davidson, an emeritus professor of psychiatry at Yale University's medical school. His book I'll devote a whole episode to because I think it's so important on this subject. So what is transcendental subjectivity, and why doesn't even most phenomenological psychology talk much about it? Well, they don't talk about it because, strictly speaking, in technical terms, it's not psychological. So I need to define terms more carefully. To start with, Husserl distinguishes between the psychical or the psychological level of human consciousness on the one hand, and the transcendental layer of consciousness on the other. For Husserl, transcendental refers to a dimension or a layer of consciousness which is not normally the focus of Western psychology. So let me explain. The simplest way to draw a line between the psychological level and the transcendental is that for Husserl, the personal ego, which he calls the psychological ego, is that layer of my consciousness for which my personal identity is simply taken as an empirical fact. For those of you who watched my episode on the natural attitude, you'll remember that I described the natural attitude of everyday life as a default perspective in which we take the people, objects, buildings, etc. around us all to be simply factual. They are what they seem to be. We take them for granted as unquestionably real, unless something extraordinary happens that throws an object into question. And the real empirical objects in the world, for me, include me myself, which Husserl sometimes refers to as I the man, meaning I the human, of course. So those of you who watched my natural attitude episode will recognize that what I'm talking about now is the same natural attitude, but applied to one's own personal identity. In other words, from the everyday perspective, my identity is just factual. I was Mark yesterday, I'm Mark today. Unless something really unexpected happens, I'll be Mark tomorrow. Same street address, same coffee maker, same life around me. This is what Husserl calls the personal ego or the psychical ego. So when this ordinary sense of myself becomes a question for me, in other words, when I choose in phenomenological reflection to suspend my default attitude of taking my identity as simply a fact, and start instead to perceive my selfhood as a phenomenal presence to be investigated, now I have temporarily suspended a natural attitude relation to my own identity. Don't get me wrong. The moment the phone rings, I'm going to answer it as Mark. If I pause this recording to make coffee, I'm not confused whose apartment I'm in or who the coffee is for. But in phenomenologizing, I enter a unique kind of reflective attitude in which I have now bracketed the empirical status of my personal ego. And for that reason, I'm no longer in a strictly psychological realm. I've temporarily disidentified from my psychological ego and have adopted an observing position in relation to the me I usually am in daily life, in order to investigate it. And as a teaser for an upcoming episode, this capacity to simply observe will be important when we discuss what Husserl means by that aspect of consciousness that he calls the disinterested witness, and sometimes calls the transcendental onlooker. More of that later. As a researcher, in adopting this new position, this new relationship to my perceptions, I'm making contact with a level or a mode of consciousness from which position I'm able to witness the person who I normally appear to be in everyday life. And if you think that this shift in perspective doesn't sound like an ordinary move for psychology, you're absolutely right. Because psychology, at least the way it's normally practiced, takes the factual existence of myself as a bounded, enduring entity for granted. In other words, psychology typically works within a natural attitude with respect to personal identity. Today, psychotherapists virtually never question or suspend the factical existence of the personal identities of their clients, because rather they're seeking to help people live more full lives and enrich or mature the identity they already have. Similarly, phenomenological psychological researchers typically treat research participants' identities as real, factual, and meaningful within the context of their lived experiences, because those researchers are interested in the psychological layer of conscious life, what Husserl called the psychical ego, or the personal ego, in order to understand what are the essential structures of psychological experience for humans in their everyday life world, the world of the natural attitude. So most phenomenological psychologists would be satisfied exploring the profound varieties of human experiences, like becoming a parent, losing a loved one, returning to a sense of health after a life-threatening illness, freeing oneself from an abusive relationship. All of these are examples of natural attitude, psychological phenomena that can be investigated without ever needing to bracket the factical status of personal identity. That's why, narrowly speaking, they are psychological phenomena. Probing whether there is such a thing as a transcendental layer of the ego is not of interest here. Now, in terms of interest, I personally was an exception to this from the beginning of my graduate studies, but that's a story for another time. Okay, so the same goes for clinical psychology. The paramount concern of clinical psychology is with the degree to which an individual human being experiences themselves as intact, at home as themselves within their own skin, relating to other people with an ongoing, clear sense of who they are. That's even more true in an individualist society like the US, where the psychologist is most often working with people who tend to see themselves as strictly bounded, meaning that boundaries are quite important. And having healthy boundaries is, for example, what enables us to make good decisions in life and recognize the difference between what you want and what I want, for example. So all of that is fully understandable in the context of everyday life, right? So actively suspending temporarily one's usual unquestionable sense of personal identity seems odd. Understandable, perhaps, as a transitional step in maturing or finding oneself in the course of psychological individuation, but that means arriving at a refined sense of one's empirical ego, not suspending the facticity of one's factical existence as such. So, feeling inspired or compelled to deeply question one's own factical existence as an empirical ego could even be viewed as a sign of actual psychological disturbance. Staying with Husserl, why might it be that uncovering what lies beyond the psychological ego would be a compelling question for him? Well, remember that I described phenomenology as consciousness studies. In fact, early in his career, Husserl explored the idea that the personal ego that we take for granted as unique, bounded, and enduring was at its root perhaps nothing but a kind of empty pole around which psychological acts were centered. An empty pole. This is a complex idea, but imagine that instead of there being a substantial, enduring me, so to speak, inside me all the time, what I take to be my consistent ego, the remembered Mark of yesterday who went grocery shopping, the Mark in the here and now recording a video, the imagined Mark waking up tomorrow morning. Maybe there's no there. I mean, maybe I only appear to myself as a solid me because all of these conscious acts are being lived as a flow of conscious states by the same organism, and so are all associated together without there being a stable I called Mark at the core of the acts. For more on this early Husserlian idea, Erwin Gervich, in studies in phenomenology and psychology, has a chapter called A Non-Egological Conception of Consciousness that's specifically focused on this phase in Husserl's career. And by the way, this phase in Husserl's thinking is sometimes compared to what Mahayana Buddhism calls Anatman, the doctrine of non-self. But Husserl himself later came to change his mind based on his own investigation, which we should always remember was undertaken in the first person, meaning Husserl was starting with his own moment-to-moment experience and reflecting philosophically on its implications. What Husserl referred to as his discovery of transcendental subjectivity was a result of his first-person inquiry into consciousness and is a milestone in the development of his phenomenology. Peter Kestenbaum wrote in his introduction to Husserl's Paris lectures, for Husserl, this investigation is not speculative. It's strictly empirical, not in the sense of measurement, but in the sense of rigorous attention to what is present and how it shows itself. So Husserl's claim that the transcendental subject is a layer that's discovered when one progressively brackets and inquires into the ground of one's own consciousness. Husserl tells us in the Cartesian Meditations, quote, as an I in the natural attitude, I am likewise and at all times a transcendental I, but I know about this only by executing phenomenological reduction. See? So in other words, the setting aside of the natural attitude that I've been discussing. So when I suspend the natural attitude in this way, Husserl tells us in the book Crisis of European Sciences, he says, quote, I am not an ego, right? Meaning in the sense of the psychical ego. Likewise, in the Paris lecture, Husserl wrote that in making contact with the transcendental dimension of one's consciousness, he says, quote, I'm not the ego of an individual man. I'm the ego in whose stream of consciousness, the world itself, including myself as an object in it, a man who exists in the world, first acquires meaning and reality. End quote. That's the transcendental subject right there. So all of this has maybe raised more questions than it's answered. So consider we're entering into a challenging and, to me, important aspect of phenomenology, one that invites dialogue with multiple other streams of thought and consciousness studies cross-culturally. Next time I'll stay with Husserl to unfold more of the implications.